Morning.
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 Appreciate you got the red shirt on again today, Roger. Restoring some order to the universe.
Go blue.
The Red Sox won big last night. I apologize. I think I sent you all an email. I'm home sick, so I'm probably not going to say a whole lot. This is not from yelling at the Celtics game last night. This is just not feeling good.
Could we get some healthier trustees on this committee?
Roger, we're keeping good company, but look at us showing up. Look at
That's
us.
right.
Look at us.
You look great. And you sound
Yeah.
great.
I put on jewelry today. That was like my next level. No makeup though for you all, just the jewelry. That's what I got. That's what I'm bringing.
Great.
Are we ready to start, Ellen?
I think we are.
Okay, well then, good morning, everyone. And I will call the meeting of the Ad Hoc Committee on Strategic Planning to order. We have two sections, a public meeting for an hour and then an executive session for the last half hour. So we're going to dive right into a conversation, which is going to be led by our friends at Huron. So I guess, Peter, I will turn it over to you.
Oh, sorry, Jim, before we do
Oh.
that, I have to do roll call.
Oh, sorry.
Good morning, everybody. Trustee Kane,
Here.
Trustee Ames,
Yes, here.
Trustee Irwin,
Here.
Trustee Gardner,
Here.
Trustee Cates.
Here.
And I know Trustee Riley and Trustee Donnelly will not be joining us. So we're all set to start.
Okay. So with that, Peter, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Jim, and good morning, everyone. Pleasure to be with you again this morning, as always. And just before we jump into today's discussion, I also want to thank everyone for their input on the data book that we've been working on for the past several months. That is now live on the strategic planning website. So thanks everyone for your feedback and comment and guidance with respect to that. More particularly today, we want to provide you a brief update on where we are with the overall effort related to strategic planning. And more particularly, we want to focus a little bit on what we are seeing as some of the emerging areas of priority focus that have arisen through our engagement with the various universities to date. I do want to emphasize that what we are sharing with you is, I would characterize as still early days. It's preliminary. It's based on input to date, but I don't want you to mistake that for being final by any means. It's not. But in addition to some discussion around emerging priorities, we also want to talk a little bit about the kinds of assets and capabilities that are necessary to realize some of the opportunities and aspirations within the system. Some of those assets and capabilities are in place and ready to be put to work. In other cases, there might be capabilities that need to be further developed in order for the system to achieve its longer term goals. And so we'll talk a little bit about both of those sorts of things. And of course, as always, we look forward to your input, comments, questions, and guidance as we go forward. So with that, Brenna, why don't I turn it over to you?
Great. Thank you, Peter. And Kate is going to share her screen with a few of the slides that I know you all received in advance. Just one thing to note as we're going through this, any feedback or reactions that you have in terms of the positioning of this document would be helpful as we look to the full board meeting on Monday. We will be sharing with the full board the same material that we are discussing today. So you all have been through this journey with us. And so any thoughts that you might have in terms of how we position the sort of verbal aspects of our presentation for Monday would be useful. And so we want to include this first strategic planning timeline for the full board in particular, because they aren't as familiar with the process that we have been on over the past 5 months. But just as a little bit of a refresher, you all know that we kicked off the engagement in January, and that we are looking to have a strategic plan in place by fall of 2023. So really in the past 5 months, we've been focused on 2 main activities. One has been a qualitative analysis where we have conducted a series of virtual stakeholder engagement sessions, both one-on-one interviews with each of the presidents and the dean of the School of Law, and also focus groups with each of the cabinets, and a few focus groups with different system staff as well. And then we accompanied the chancellor and his team in the spring campus visits. And at each campus, we had a staff focus group, a faculty focus group, a student focus group, and a cabinet focus group. And in parallel to this qualitative analysis, we have also been creating a data book, which is really the quantitative analysis of both looking internally at the University of Maine system and some of the enrollment, financial, market dynamics happening within Maine, and then also comparing those dynamics with peers in New England and also nationally. So as we turn the corner into the summer and into the fall, we are now going to begin to prioritize some of these ideas. At this point, it's been ideation, getting all of the ideas of individuals and what surfaced in the data in terms of where the system could potentially focus. And as we move into the summer, we are going to begin to ask both this group, our President's Council group, and our working group to help us begin to prioritize. So on the next slide, we wanted to just share here a little bit of a heat map of the themes that came up during the campus visits. So you can see here that in dark green, we have items that came up frequently. And in gold, we have items that came up infrequently. And we do this just so you can get a little bit of an idea of the texture of the conversations at each of the universities. So just to provide a little bit of color commentary on this one, you see the first, and I'll start by saying that we have these dark blue themes, and then we've also categorized them in the gray, just to orient you a bit with the audience-related themes, the themes that are more particular to the institution or the operation of each institution, state assets, and then enablers. And so these are things like system governance, decision-making, how the brand is perceived. And so I'll say a little bit of words on each one. In terms of the improved retention, persistence, and completion, this is an idea that people are very focused on. Individuals, when asked, what are the strengths of the University of Maine system and what should we continue, many people's first reaction is affordability, and that we would really like to maintain that affordability. In parallel to that, people also mentioned this idea of retention and thinking about, I could highlight at Machias, for example, we had a robust conversation about the importance of flexible credit transfers and visible transfer pathways. Actually, in our student focus group, some of the students said that, really students here look at community colleges first, prior to looking at the other institutions in the University of Maine system. So of course, that's something we want to have on our radar to really underscore, especially with unified accreditation, just the pathways where students are able to take courses at other universities or potentially even transfer. In terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion, this was interesting because actually in our virtual stakeholder engagement, which was with presidents and with cabinets, Diversity, equity, and inclusion didn't come up too often, but once we got to the campus visits and we're talking with different audiences, this actually did begin to come up in, you can see the colors wasn't, it's not all green, but one of the ways that it did come up was actually with an emphasis on the inclusion piece. And it was actually pretty encouraging to us that students, staff, and faculty could draw connections between the importance of inclusion practices in regards to how that affects retention. We did have a robust conversation about this at Fort Kent, and especially there are a lot of international students. And so that was even more important to really ensure that students feel included both on campus and in the community. In terms of the adult market, we talked a bit about some prototypes that are in place, like Your Pace, where we could scale an existing adult market focused offering. Your Pace is something that exists at UMPI to a much larger level. At UMA, we had a good conversation about the adult market and maybe even reimagining some of these UMA centers and extending their use to all students. We also talked about prior learning assessments, and there actually is something in place at the system currently for adults to receive credit for prior learning, but that might not be as communicated broadly as it could. There were some actually adult students in our UMA focus group that didn't know that that was something that they could utilize. Research initiatives, this has come up a little bit through our conversations, and some individuals feel that we could really focus on environmental sustainability and do some really special things, connecting and focus on environment and state of Maine assets to a robust initiative related to research and also teaching in regards to the environment. Others think that a high priority area that we could focus on in regard to research is allied health and really leveraging the strengths in nursing and connecting that to a allied health, thinking more proactively about, not being on the the medical care side, but thinking about public health and the proactive elements of that. Continuing the commitment of universities as economic and cultural engines, that was very clear that there are universities that exist across the state of Maine and that are really powerful engines for the community. And so people really want to make sure that that continues. Better leveraging the state of Maine assets. You can see that is the only column on here that has dark green all the way through. Many people feel that Maine consists of varied geographies and economies, and that the system can continue and even better leverage these varied geographies for teaching, learning, service, and research opportunities. Then we get into the enablers. So part of the difference in a system strategic plan as opposed to a university strategic plan is really trying to elevate and get individuals thinking about collaboration opportunities that could exist across institutions. So our conversations on campus sort of went there naturally as part of a system strategic plan. And we did really hear some great examples of collaboration that are currently in place. People spoke to a nursing collaboration on the academic side, where different nursing programs are already meeting. Faculty groups and program directors are meeting to discuss the differences in the nursing programs that exist at their institution, but also sharing best practices to address the nursing shortage in the state. So that is a really real outcome that seems to be a really positive collaboration in place. On the administrative side, there are positive collaborations in place like financial aid and facilities. And then we also had some conversations about some barriers that exist to collaboration. People spoke about the budget model being a barrier to their collaboration with other universities, and then also some having common transfer policies in place. In terms of an interest in collaboration and partnership and scale, thinking about what is the value proposition to them of being a part of a system. Some individuals thought that we could really have a system level marketing and communications effort that could be very beneficial. And then also some thoughts on system level professional development. So, when the question was posed of what can the system offer you that you couldn't achieve if you were an individual university, some people thought about professional development and shadowing. So could I, if I was a new employee at Fort Kent, could I go over to Farmington even, or Presque Isle, and shadow someone in my same function, either in person or on Zoom? And of course, there'll be nuances in different campus cultures, but that would be a really positive part of being a part of a system. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Kate to walk through each of these areas, and also seeking to marry in some of the data book findings to these stakeholder engagement themes.
Great. Thanks, Brenna. And I'll stop in case there are any questions before I move ahead. Okay, seeing none. What we really tried to do in the next slide is create a summary for the board to review. And this will be a summary of the priority areas and corresponding data points that are in the second document that we sent that include some items for the executive session and then the full board report. So the goal really here was to really draw a line through all of these themes, and then the data that really supports the cause for change, or the cause for urgency, as we've been talking about, right, as a purpose of the data book. So as you can see here, I won't read out all of these ad nauseum, but I think that, highlighting something like, innovating the traditional academic model, we really often heard through a number of engagements that, this could be an opportunity to reconsider how UMS offers, academics. Could there, become a universal core curriculum throughout the system? Could we change how we deliver courses during the semester to 7 to 8 week modules to, support progress moving forward for students, so that they can kind of, see how they're moving forward in their degree faster, right? And it keeps them more engaged. And so we looked at some of the points in the data book and pulled out the most relevant one, which we felt when we examined the groups of, commuters and residential students online, right? We understand that there is a really big increase, much of it driven by the pandemic, but we know that this isn't going to change, right? Going into the future, students are really going to expect, really hybrid environments for their education, and some may choose to go fully online, but that there are some really strong residential components of many of the universities in the system as well. So I think really thinking through, how these work together, and then how you can use the data to move forward, to think about, creating strategic priorities around those items. The same with, better leveraging the state of Maine assets. We, understand that University of Maine system really offers a significant benefit to the state, but that there are so many different experiential and economic development opportunities that haven't been taken fully advantage of within the state. And so that this really gives you an opportunity to examine what those are and think about either reinforcing bridges that you've built, or really developing new bridges in different communities or economies or industries that could bring, a lot of a strong reputation to Maine, that could build a better pipeline for students, and then also residents as talent to the state as well. So on the next slide, after we look at some of the strategic priorities, we also connected the strategic enablers in a way. And the strategic enablers really are those items that will help support the development of these strategic priorities, right? Thinking about the things that will help make these items happen. So when we think about scale, scope, and infrastructure, we're really thinking about how to best maximize what we have in this system, and thinking about, how we modernize space, right? Are there innovative partnerships that are happening at the University of Maine Orono campus with some of the public-private partnerships to develop the hotel space? Are there ways to help modernize campuses so that they become more attractive to students, and also help to retain them as well. Same again with things like brand and value perception. There's been a significant thread of folks who have said we really need to centralize a marketing function, or again, we're continuing to get feedback from Vision Point to think about having kind of a unified message from the system, but also messages that really establish a brand and identity for each of the individual universities, which is something again that we've heard throughout the entire stack of stakeholder engagements. So what I thought I would do as well is to show you, again, because these are kind of rolled up into higher level concepts, just walk you through very quickly a couple of the slides in the full board report. And so really this pattern repeats itself through each of the slides. And so, under retention, persistence, and completion, we see a more detailed description. What we thought would be really valuable, as well as to give you a sense of what some of the stakeholder comments were. So here, someone was really passionate about making sure the system provided a post-secondary credential for every Maine citizen, right? So how can we think about, bringing in, the looking at the higher ed marketplace and seeing that there's declining demographics, and how we can actually help support the citizens of Maine to be a more educated population, and that, thinking about ways to help keep folks engaged in education all the way through to completion so that they do have that credential, whatever that final credential might be. And then again, tying in the data that we've been talking about in the data book, I think from early stages, and then really looking at some of the opportunities and risks with the level of action that comes with building strategic priorities from this theme, right? So here, for example, we see that, an investment in these student services, which some campuses have talked about, right? That at USM, for example, there was a faculty member who brought up the significant investment the campus has made over the last number of years to really make sure that retention was focused on in areas like residential life or financial aid, or in other student services to support students, and that the pandemic really had a significant impact in actually pulling back on much of that progress that had occurred. So thinking about what is that opportunity now going forward based on what you know and what you've learned in recent years, and then thinking about the risks, right, that may occur. So if there isn't an investment in these areas like retention, persistence, and completion, what could happen, right? Will we have a strong workforce supply? How will the population be credentialed? Will you be able to play, kind of in that workforce space as well moving forward? If we're not retaining and completing students going forward. So I think that what this is really trying to do is kind of marry all of these points together to make a really strong case for either including this as a strategic priority or a case for change. And then just to show, another example, this theme repeats on something like the adult market, which is again, another theme that we heard fairly consistently across a number of campuses, is that there really is much broader opportunity to engage adult learners, but at different levels and in different ways, right? So I think you'll find that within each of these themes, there are some that are really unique to each theme, and there are some that tie into other themes as well. So I would think of those as cross-cutting between individual themes. So among the adult market, we heard that some campuses like UMaine Farming could think about adapting their traditional model, right? To work with more adults in the local area, because that is a really good opportunity. They haven't adapted their academic model so that it would be more accommodating to adults. Other folks have come up with ideas, for example, that's listed here. We're talking about, using the centers that are at University of Maine Augusta and across the state as different types of entry points and really expanding that access to adult learners. And others have talked about, thinking about the ways in which adults need to be supported, because their context as a learner coming to earn a credential is much different than a traditional aged student in the state. So I think a number of these things tie together really well when you think about how we create priorities. And then again, here, when we think about, opportunities and risks, we can see that there are a lot of opportunities where some campuses mentioned, being a stronger player in, workforce partnerships, developing credentials with local businesses or other corporate relationships. So again, I think it gives you a great way to really think through, if this is a priority that you want to pursue based on the stakeholder engagement themes that we've heard, and how we would go about that with supporting data and other information. I'll pause there if there are any questions.
Yeah, Kate, I got a question. I'm sorry if you can understand me. I think both you and Brianna mentioned the prospect of using the UMA centers in a different or expanded way than they have been used. Could you just expand on that if you can?
Sure.
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead,
Yeah.
Brenna. You had that conversation more than I did.
Yep. So this came up actually in the student focus group and the staff focus group. And the idea was that right now, the centers for UMA, the students that use them are really UMA students. And the thought was, could other students across the system be welcomed into these centers to utilize the services that are there? That was one. The other comment and thought that was brought up is, could we actually reimagine what student services we are conducting at these centers in terms of thinking about student needs 10 years from now? Might look a little different than what they have been or what they are today. And I think there were some students talking about ways that they're trying to get over the COVID hump and get people back in person at the centers by putting out flyers for events. And there might be a little bit of struggle with engagement in, getting people back in person. And so the kind of conversation went of, what services really would be the highest demand and the best return on investment to be conducted through these centers.
Thanks, Brenna. Any other questions about either these two slides or any of the other kind of more fully fleshed out themes that are in this aspect of the documents that we shared? Okay, if none, I'm going to go ahead and pass it to Kathy.
Happy to take this, Kate. I thought you were going to take it, but I'm happy to do it if you'd like.
Oh, apologies. Go ahead.
What's that?
I said apologies. Go ahead. Oops.
Yeah, so as you all know, the Unified Accreditation process began before the strategic planning process did. And it has been positioned as a very important tool to enabling strategic planning. So the alignment with Unified Accreditation is something that we have spent quite some time thinking about, talking about, and ensuring that they work. The processes are coming together in a consistent and I think a timely way. And I welcome Jeff to add to this conversation if he'd like. As you look at the strategic planning themes, we have pulled out some of the alignments where we think Unified Accreditation both supports and aligns well with the theme. So these are the themes that Brenna talked through earlier. And as you think about Unified Accreditation, the Unified Catalog that Jeff and team are working on, you can see some of the ways that this tool will help. So let me identify a few areas in this chart, and I open it up for questions. So as we think about retention, persistence, and completion, that has come up consistently as an area where Unified Accreditation processes will help. Allowing students to really think about the system as a whole, take advantage of a unified catalog, and frictionlessly, which isn't really a word, but in a seamless way, participate in coursework across the system. So the other area I would like to raise is diversity, equity, and inclusion. The framework within Unified Accreditation really encourages a focus, particularly on the inclusion aspect, as you think again about a system as a whole, and even drilling down further as the systemness aspects of Unified Accreditation come across. There are a number of areas of collaboration that can really advance inclusion aspects that Brenna mentioned. Research has come up as another area. Certainly, University of Maine's R1 status is something to be really proud of. Unified Accreditation does support the advancement of what's coming across in the strategic plan as certainly a priority. In many of our campus visits and many of our stakeholder discussions, the ability to leverage University of Maine's strength with research will be enhanced with unified accreditation. And will very much likely be part of the strategic planning set of priorities. So I guess the message here is that these processes really are joined at the hip, but in very different ways. Unified accreditation is a tool. The strategic planning outcome is a vision and set of actions that those tools will support. Any questions about the details here? Or I welcome Jeff or anybody else to highlight stuff if I've forgotten. Any comments? Okay, we'll be talking more about this at the full board meeting, both in the open session as well as executive session. Get into a little bit more of the details. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Kathy. So if we wanted to go back to this heat map, I mentioned at the top of my comments that as we turn the corner into the summer, we are going to more formally begin to prioritize. But would love to begin this conversation now with just initial thoughts on priorities. So as we look at these audience-related operational and state assets, these emerging priorities, if you will, that have come up through our stakeholder engagement and that are supported by the data, which of these themes do you view as the most important priorities for the system moving forward?
So can I just, it's the frame of the question that I think I am stuck on a little bit, because I think we are talking about strategic planning for the system, but I think what we're talking about is how do we strengthen our campuses? Like, I think to me, I am, the heat map is really interesting to me about kind of what's showing up. I think but even there, you see that not all the campuses are the same. And so I think even the frame of the question, it should be about what can the system do to strengthen the campuses? Like, what can we do? How can this, like the question of the one around defined system governance really struck me. Because I think that does mean something different to each of the campuses, right? And what they need and what they don't need. I guess I'm not sure, like, better leveraging state of Maine assets means the same thing on all the campuses. I don't know. I'm not trying to be difficult. I'm just trying to.
Emily, I don't know if this helps. I see this as being a more fundamental level conversation. Mm-hmm. All of these are relevant to all the campuses. The differentiation, the uniqueness, all of that comes into play, but they're more fundamental than that are things like, do we have an operating model that's fiscally sustainable? Do we, in the aggregate, have programs and delivery models and access features and support that make us competitive in this changing world? It's to me, that's the level that I think this sort of gets at, as opposed to, campus A versus campus B. That's how I would look at it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's bears out in all the data, right? That what you're talking about for sure. So okay, I'll just keep listening, and I will.
My reaction to your comment, Trustee Kane, is that the audience-related operational and state assets all relate to potential priorities that the system could decide to focus on in the future. The enablers, and your point on the system governance, kind of gets to the question of what can the system do and how can the system be structured in the best way to support these priorities? And so the first question that I sort of opened with was, elevate diversity, equity, inclusion versus improve retention, persistence, completion versus cultivating the adult market versus innovating the traditional academic model. Which of these priorities stands out as this needs to be the number one priority that the system is going to focus on in the future?
So can I jump in on, this is a question that I had when I saw this heat map, which is themes that arose from your groups and your interviews, right? So you weren't saying, here are the themes, what do you think? You were saying, what do you think, right? So one of the things that I find very hard to find in here is a recognition on the campuses about the just basic fiscal challenges of our current operating model. I don't see that in here. Did I miss it, or is it hidden in, or is it implicitly one of those issues? Because that's got to be among the top 3 priorities, and it's not even there.
It certainly came up, not always implicitly, often explicitly, in the context of thinking about things, for example, retention, persistence, increasing enrollment. There's a recognition that we need to stabilize or enhance the financial position. So these are more action-oriented rather than results-oriented in that sense. These are activities versus end goals.
I would also just add, Jim, that this is an iterative process. Our visit to each university was our first time having a chance to speak with folks. And so we positioned ourselves very much as listeners. We wanted to be an attentive set of ears, hearing the interests and concerns of the communities of each university. And to your point, we were not seeking to prompt people to comment on specific issues. We wanted to hear organically what came up. We were, in certain respects, also seeking to create some baseline understandings of the reality that the system finds itself in, whether demographically, financially, or otherwise, both with respect to constraints and opportunities. And so what you see here, again, I would underscore preliminary, you see some emerging patterns, some areas of convergence, some areas of divergence. Many of the areas of divergence are quite logical. You can see why certain universities are more or less interested in certain issues. But they, in different ways, represent opportunities and challenges to create greater coordination and alignment across the system. So in a sense, what we see here is, what's the degree of difficulty or the ease of execution with respect to strengthening the alignment across the universities in the system? But because this is iterative, there's still more conversation to be had, still more need for that conversation to be grounded in things like the fiscal realities that the system has to contend with. So I just want to put this in brackets that we're starting a conversation, we haven't finished it, and we want to approach that conversation in a way that invites participation rather than forecloses it.
Yeah, and I understand that, and I'm not questioning that at all, and I appreciate that clarification. What I'm curious about is asking us to prioritize from what looks to me like maybe it's an incomplete list. That's my, we can certainly do it from among these. I just that was just a noteworthy thing to me.
And I would agree, it is not comprehensive. And I suppose another way to think about the question here is, where do you see some tools here that we can work with? Where do you see opportunities to leverage some of the commentary that we're hearing from the university communities to achieve system-wide goals? That may be another way of framing the question.
The other thing that surprises me, and the board has spent quite a bit of time talking about this, and maybe it's buried in there and I'm just not seeing it, is just the whole issue around our crumbling infrastructure. And, you know, that, in my view, always has been directly related to recruitment, probably to a lesser degree retention, but that's a little bit surprising to me. Kind of goes along a little bit with what Jim is saying. It just a recognition that it would be incredibly costly, and we don't have a lot of, you know, our economic challenges, but I'm surprised it's not in there.
Yeah, that actually did come up, and we grouped it in the scale, scope, and infrastructure. I think to your point, it may be scale and scope is a different item than the physical infrastructure. And so decoupling it is helpful feedback.
I had one other observation while we're on this, which is I thought actually there's a pretty good commonality across the campuses based on this map. There are only a few areas of what you might describe as divergence, and I don't think any of them are disabling to the system's ability to move forward with a plan that can work. So I thought that was encouraging.
Any other thoughts or feedback in regard to going into the full board meeting on Monday with this material?
I would definitely echo Lisa's pulling out the infrastructure piece. I think the board will notice that for sure. I also, Jim, I'm thinking about your comment about the financial stuff not showing up. And I feel like it's almost like the unspoken thing that's underneath all of those, right? Because I'd be curious for those of you who are compiling the data, looking at that map, because money's required to do any of those things. I'd be curious as you tease out the data, if there were, you know, comments about how money is spent or how money and resources are prioritized, that also may give us a glimpse into how people feel.
If I might just share with you, there are issues, and money is one of them, that is seen largely by a group of people as someone else's problem. And so that gets divided out as, I don't need to worry about that because that's their problem, not mine. And there would be difference between staff, for instance, and faculty, for instance, and administration on that particular issue, but I'm not sure it was examined that way, if that makes any sense.
I think that's a really excellent point, and I think that's what I was trying to say. You just said it better. I think that's right. I think it's not on the list explicitly because it is seen as somebody else's area.
Yeah, the people we don't like the system should take care of that.
What did come up quite a bit, and I believe Brenna alluded to this early on. And remember, we're talking about feedback from campus stakeholders and constituents, so their perception of reality. What did come up quite a bit is the sense of inequity, and inequity probably isn't the right term, but the budget model creating allocations of revenue and other things that leads to each individual campus starving. And this particularly came up with the smaller campuses. So less recognition that the system as a whole needs additional resources, to your point, but certainly on some of the campuses, there is a sense we don't have enough money. And it's because of the budget model or other incentives or disincentives.
I think there's always that. I mean, we went through a process of changing that model, and it doesn't matter what you change it to. It doesn't matter, that our appropriation has increased by $40 million since we started this work. It's just the nature that everyone is always going, there's never enough money. We get $40 million and most of it gets plowed into wages. So I think you always get that tension. The other tension that's just part of this conversation when we talk about a sustainable financial model is, we immediately started off this conversation talking about the emphasis on affordability. And when I hear affordability, I have a different reaction probably than nearly everyone, which just means, year after year after year of freezing tuition at the same time our student population goes down just is that's just math. That is just automatically bringing in less revenue every single year. And so it's hard for me to understand how we could get more affordable. We continue to keep tuition costs flat. Our campuses continue to increase the amount of financial aid that they give out, despite the fact that the number of students is continuing to decline. So there is a little bit of tension in this fiscal sustainability, but we also need to be affordable, and we need to keep increasing our financial aid and bragging about that, and we need to keep freezing our tuition. So that can be a campaign issue at some point, and it was probably several years ago. Those are going to bump up against each other, and you're not going to have enough resources, and that's where we find ourselves.
So Ryan, you put your finger on a point that I think pervades this whole process and actually pervades the whole question of strategy and future. And that is it whether it's enough to make the current model maximally efficient, or whether that's insufficient to position the system for success in the future, because the model itself is a big part of the problem. And I think the market is telling us that the model is going to change. It's already changing. And I think as we go forward with this, I hope that there is a lot of thought given and opportunity for a discussion across all kind of stakeholder groups about this question of the sort of traditional higher ed model. And how do we create strategic differentiation in this market? When everybody's doing all this kind of the same things we are, and just trying to be able to do what we do more efficiently, and maybe not raise prices as fast as has been the case over the last 30 years. And I just think that's fighting the last war, and it's going to fall short of where we really need to end up. Those are the hardest questions, but those I think are the ones that ultimately a real strategic planning process answers. And the answers aren't necessarily definitive, but they at least imply a direction that you constantly modify as you go forward. That's where I feel, that's where I think we need to, the board really needs to make sure that we don't lose sight of that question.
Jim, I'd like to build on that a little bit, which is I think the unified accreditation, which underpins all of this, right? Because it's a process we're committed to, and first in the nation, right, to do it. I think there's one of the things I also take away from that heat map is that balance of how do we, as you said, Brent, I think you said, we're not going back to the fully traditional model we had before, where everyone's on campus, and we're going to have to be more innovative, more customizable, more allowing people to learn from where they learn best, right? Rather than necessarily on the campus. And I think one of the things that I think sort of exciting is because we are in Maine, and you also see on there sort of the pride in state assets and what we have as a state from a saleability perspective. It might be interesting to think about us as, in addition to unified accreditation, leading on what is a post-pandemic, research one comprehensive public education opportunity look like. And I think the good news is, because of the size that we are and our geographic distance, quite frankly, because we do have something for everybody. If you want mountains, if you want coast, if you want lakes, we have all of it. That to me is something that's exciting about this, is how do we become in the nation a leader on doing that right, where you can learn from where you learn best and still be a part of a vibrant learning community, research community, as much as possible, inclusive and diverse community.
I think that's absolutely right. There's one more piece to it, though, that I think is we haven't really talked about, and it's really on the academic innovation side. It's on the what are we teaching, and how do we know it's right, and how do we know it's going to be right, and how do we keep it right? And that's to me that's this whole notion of this continuum and this constant feedback between the workplace and institutions and faculty and programs. It's not at the president level, it's not at the system level, it's at the department level, where these relationships have to be they have to permeate our institutions. And to me, that's the way you make sure that when the student gets the degree, it means what the student needs it to be, which is what you need to know for what you're going to do. You're positioned for success. You're not positioned for success 20 years ago. You're positioned for success now and 20 years from now. And that's this constant, and that's a full-on engagement between the institutions and the market, the civic institutions and the employers. And I think it works back the other way as well. It works back to pre-K to 12. And I think that one of the ways that the University of Maine system can truly innovate, I think, is to infuse into its existence these tight connections outside itself that should strongly imply a higher quality and more relevant educational experience. And I know we're doing some of these things. I'm not saying we're not doing it. I'm just saying it's not our strategy. It's not everybody has to do this. This is our business model. That's the kind of thing that I hope we will. I mean, this is my last one of these meetings, so this is all on you guys now. But I hope we will. That will be a strong focus going forward. Because that's a story you can tell. The market will respond to that.
But I just join for a minute and say that for our system, there is large-scale experimentation in addressing some of that, specifically at Presque Isle and the Your Pace program, which is showing, quite frankly, very tremendous success, and is starting to garner attention from other institutions, most specifically their neighbor at Fort Kent's taking a very serious look at it, but other people as well. And the interesting thing about that program is you really do get instant feedback on what people want to study, because that's what they're choosing. And so I don't think we should ignore that fact, and then maybe our partners in this endeavor could think about that a little bit further, and how experimentation and success at our individual universities needs to morph into success on a broader basis.
And if I could just offer a quick comment following both of those remarks, I do see significant opportunity in the domain of connections with the local economies within which each university is situated. And I see opportunities both at the university level and even, Jim, as you say, down to the department level, but also at the system level. So one of the issues that has been a topic of conversation as we've visited each university is the potential for the system to play an important role in creating the infrastructure necessary to more effectively manage those external relationships. And so this is not an uncommon challenge at many individual universities or at many public systems, but developing the right customer relationship management tools, the infrastructure necessary to manage, let's say, employers with whom you have internship relationships or research collaborations. Often that information is buried on, individual faculty or department chair spreadsheets, et cetera, et cetera. All of this needs to be surfaced. And I think the system can play an important role in creating greater visibility into those relationships, who the key contact points are at each organization, and also help to facilitate the nurturing of those relationships over time so that they deepen. And so that really means taking a kind of an account management relationship to how we engage with community organizations, whether that's employers, government agencies, nonprofit organizations, all of the various kinds of external entities that the various universities are interacting with. That can absolutely create win-win relationships, career pathways, research collaboration, better designed curricula. So absolutely agree on that front. And I do think that's an area where greater coordination and collaboration across the universities and aided by the system office can realize some significant gains. So that is absolutely something we expect to be exploring further.
I'd like to go back to Emily's point. I think one of your questions was how is this helpful, or should we change any of it for the board meeting? Emily's point about just the natural assets that Maine has to offer, I don't know if that's necessarily what you meant when you said better leverage state of Maine assets, or maybe it is. But I think the point is, to me, that's a vague statement. And were you talking about more money from the legislature, or were you talking about Maine's natural beauty? I'm not quite sure what you mean there.
Yes, the natural beauty. So the mountains to the lakes to the forests, and the accompanying full detail slides is where we kind of go into a little bit more detail on that. And I think the next slide also mentions the sort of physical assets of the state of Maine. But if that's not clear, which I completely take the point that assets could refer to financial resources as well. It might be, that's really helpful feedback, and exactly the type of thing that is helpful for us to incorporate into Monday's meeting. So
I think Brenna, that's right. I think it's also more than that. I think it's in part about the rationales for attracting individuals to study in Maine. So part of that is just what are the features of life in Maine? What are the benefits of that? So that gets to things like geography, coast, culture, nature, tourism, et cetera. But it's also the logical linkages to industry and what kinds of professional opportunities that creates, and also what kind of economic development opportunities that creates, whether that's in industries like biofuels, green energy, aquaculture, data analytics. So it's really meant to be that continuum. But one of the things that we heard at many of the universities that we visited is the belief that people who know Maine and are attracted to Maine are enrolling at Maine institutions, but that we aren't getting that message out as effectively beyond the borders of Maine, and that's a missed opportunity. And so I think it speaks both to the attractions for learners, but then also, why would they stay? How do they build careers? So I think it's really that whole continuum.
I have a question. It's more of a process question, I think, as I've been listening to the discussion and looking at the roadmap of work ahead. As you go from the priorities and the concerns and the strategic enablers, before you get into drafting different drafts of a plan, will this group or will some group set some must priorities that the plan must address? And because what's missing for me is what is some of those musts. And the whole conversation earlier around financial stability and the need to be able to afford to do the things that many of these other components will drive, seems to me that it really needs to stand out as one of the most important things that the strategic plan has to solve for, is somehow putting strategically into the system a plan that will allow for financial stability at all campuses or in the system, and going forward with some basic assumptions around what appropriations will be. And I know we do these 5-year models, and Ryan and his group do a great job at that. But if we look back at at our results, it's basically we're coming up short every single year with at least 2 to sometimes 3 campuses unable to balance budgets and do the things that they want to do. Regardless of how money's allocated, the total pot is coming up too short, and it's going to continue to. So as we think about how do we solve for some of the needs in the system, it's got to go against a backdrop of we must be financially stable first and foremost. Otherwise, you can't do anything. And I'm not seeing that yet coming through this work. And to me, it's probably the cornerstone of the future design.
So Mark, the short answer to your question is absolutely yes. You can underscore that 3 times. We're about a third of a way into an 18-month process. So what we are trying to do here is to play back the concerns that we're hearing expressed at each university. Now, this committee is a decisive body that's actually going to make decisions and actually, lead the design and key messages of the plan itself. So this is an input for you to reflect on, and it is necessarily going to be an incomplete picture of all of the issues that need to be contended with as we think about the future of the system. And that's not surprising. Whether you're a staff member or a faculty member or a student at, university A, B, or C, you don't spend much time thinking about the sustainability of the system as a whole. You take those things as givens, for better or worse. But one of the other key steps in the process here, which is upcoming soon, is for us to engage with external stakeholders, right? So there's a whole other set of voices that we haven't heard from yet that are also going to be very important with respect to how we think about, the success to date, the gaps, and where the opportunities are. So absolutely, very much yes, 100% agree. We're just not in the process. We're not that far along in the process.
So you're raising for me one of the communications challenges I think the work has, and I've heard it like 3 times now in this session, which I believe is very true, that most people working within the system, whatever campus they're on, A, B, C, or D, they probably don't think about the financial stability of the system unless it impacts their ability to do something in their program or their course. Otherwise, it's somebody else's problem. Somehow we have got to bring the whole collective bodies of people, educational level and knowledge level up to it, is that we do all need to worry about it, because even though your program might today be fine, if you continue on this demographic trend and revenue trend that we have, you're only 2 years away from having a problem here. So it really needs to be baked into more of the discussion, and I think it's very important that we all get to the place where we realize, well, we may not have enough money to do everything we're doing today.
Right.
So what are the things that we're going to really prioritize on? It's going to make the University of Maine system or the University of Maine campus A, B, C, or D stand out to the rest of the world, and that's what we're going to fund to make sure they're really, really very good at it. And these other things we just can't afford to do at some point.
Absolutely, and I do keep noting that this is an iterative process, and that's by no means an excuse. That's actually an intentional element of the design. When we think about the change effort that's required, we have to introduce ideas, give people time to get their heads around them, and then really begin to confront, okay, well, what are the takeaways of that information? How do we begin to act? And insofar as the data book has just become public, that's a key part of that. Right. And again, we do anticipate having further dialogue with each university community in the fall. So we are trying to stage both the substantive contribution that we are seeking from all of the various constituencies across the system, along with the mindset change that is required to really authentically grapple both with the challenges, but also the opportunities, right? Because we also need to stimulate creative thinking about what's possible. So absolutely agree, and we will be making gains in those areas for sure.
So for the board meeting on Monday, I would suggest that somewhere in your discussion that you add a little bit of time to talk about what you just shared, Peter, how we go from where we are today to what are some of the, maybe spend a little bit more time on these next steps and how we educate people and how we engage more folks in having the dialogue and the discussion and the learnings around how we do things better or differently, and what things do we want to emphasize. That's really the meat of the work. And I think the more we talk about that's upcoming and how we engage with folks on it, it's very important.
That's a very, very helpful suggestion, very good suggestion, and we can certainly do that.
Yeah, thanks.
Let me just add to Mark what you and Peter were just talking about, which is this is a very helpful foundational stage, because what we're getting is a reflection of where people are coming from. And a strategic plan absolutely needs to reflect on that. People need to feel heard, and then to effectively start implementing things, you need to bring it all together. And so I think we've heard some really helpful comments. We've got a good sense of where the campuses are coming from. It is by no means, as you said, complete. The data book is going to help quite a bit, I think, in setting a tone of reality. So we're in a good place. The other thing is I feel really good because there's some really good examples of opportunities to build on to improve the system as a whole. So we're at a good place.
If I could add one last thing, and this is more just a technical thing. When it comes to Monday's discussion, this is so very important, and we need to give it as much time as we can. But however, as somebody who has to manage that whole day, the day is very, very full with, you'll have roughly around 40 minutes and make the most of those 40 minutes, but I don't want to have to cut it too short if you haven't, so it's going to be a tight day, very tight day. Just wanted to give you a heads up on that.
So are we, anything else? We have time still for executive session. I want to make sure that we don't give any of the things that are in front of us inadequate time or discussion. Does anybody have anything else on what we've talked about so far? Are we ready to go to executive session? I don't see any reason why we aren't, so I will find the language here, and I will call for a motion to go into executive session under 1 MRSA section 405(6)(a) for discussion or consideration of the employment, appointment, assignment, duties, promotion, demotion, compensation, evaluation of et cetera of public officials or appointees, and also 405(6)(c) discussion of the consideration, acquisition, or use of real property or personal property currently attached to real property or interest therein, or disposition of public property or economic development, if premature disclosure would prejudice the competitive bargaining position of the agency. So on those two bases, I will call for a motion.
So moved.
Second.
Okay, moved by trustee Eames, seconded by trustee Kane. And Ellen, could you call the roll?
Certainly. Trustee King,
Yes.
trustee Ames,
Yes.
trustee Irwin,
Yes.
trustee Gardner,
Yes.
trustee Cates.
Yes.
The motion is carried.